In my previous video, I talked about what experiential learning was and why it was so powerful. I'd like to drop down, give you a little more detail on that. But first, it's important to see a spectrum here. At this end of the spectrum, we have an activity. So I would like you to think now about a training classroom where you have people in an environment, typically in the corporate world, where they're trying to learn something. At this end, you have an activity. It tends to be short, and it just tends to be something that's engaging. At this far end here, you have what I would call a simulation. Simulation is very long. It takes a long time to go through, and it is in fact an exact replica of the individual's world. These tend to be very complex. For example, if you're in the airline industry, you actually use a simulator, and a simulator literally simulates what a pilot does in a cockpit. In the middle here, we have experiential. And experiential learning sits between these two. Experiential learning is typically, not always, 2 to 4 hours and tends to be very powerful for 3 reasons. And that's what I would really like to share with you now. The 3 reasons why it is so powerful. If this represents my real world, and then I go through an experience here, and I come out the other end, what I learn here has to have impact on my real world. It has to make a difference on my real world. So therefore, that experiential learning component has 3 very distinct qualities, which are built into a world-class experiential learning event. The first is it must mirror reality. By that I mean this experience here must be a mirror of the real world. The second is it must produce predictable learning. So sometimes an activity, for example, they do it and then we see what happens. But in experiential learning, there must be predictable learning because it has to come back and feed back into the real world. And the third, there must be visceral involvement. And I use the word visceral intentionally. An experiential learning event must grab the learner so they are fully immersed, fully engaged. They do not realize, as I'll chat later in the series, they do not realize that in fact they are going through something that is a mirror of the reality, that does have predictable learning, but it sure gets them involved. And then later, as they get to the end, when we come to the debrief at this end out here, they go, wow, that was a lot like my real world. Wow, the learnings I got here, I can apply. So great experiential learning, which sits in this spectrum at this position, must have a mirror of reality, some guaranteed predictable learning, and visceral involvement.